Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. There was something oddly poetic about the way Mara's life had settled into stillness, as though someone had pressed pause on a song halfway through the chorus. Each day woke her not with excitement but with obligation, the rhythm of her mornings unchanging and unchallenged. The shrill cry of the alarm clock sliced through her slumber at exactly 5:45 a.m., as if it were reminding her how precise misery could be when rehearsed for long enough. She'd rise slowly, bones stiff like aging wood, and pad across the cold tiles of her kitchen floor, where the kettle awaited its dance, and silence clung to the air like steam on glass. Outside, the streets of Elmsworth yawned under gray skies, the same way they had every day since her 20s had tiptoed away. Her flower shop, Mara's Petals, opened at 7 sharp, but customers rarely came until 9. Still, she'd sweep the floors with methodical grace, prune petals already perfect, and rearrange vases for no one in particular. It wasn't madness, it was muscle memory. She used to hum while she worked, but lately, even that felt like asking too much of herself. Somewhere between the wilting roses and her husband's lukewarm glances, the color had drained from her world like paint washed in rainwater. Henry Whitman was not an unkind man by nature, but kindness, once neglected, becomes a stranger at the dinner table. Once upon a younger year, he had been charming. The kind of man who could make strangers laugh and line at the grocery store and kiss his wife's temple just because. But time had gnawed at him. Responsibility turned his shoulders inward, and disappointment carved lines into his face. By the time he turned 42, Henry looked like a man perpetually waiting for something better to arrive, though he wouldn't lift a finger to go and find it. The hardware store he managed paid enough to keep the lights on, but it never lit anything inside him. His laughter had become rare currency, doled out with suspicion. With Mara, his affection had curdled into silence. They didn't fight, they just stopped trying. Their marriage had become a long hallway with no doors. Dinner was a chore. Conversations were reduced to grunts and nods. They shared a bed, but not warmth. If Mara dared to bring up her flower shop dreams, the expansion plans, the blog, the little greenhouse she wanted to build in the back, Henry would either change the subject or offer a dismissive grunt that felt like a slap in disguise. He didn't need to raise his voice. Indifference is its own kind of cruelty. Hope, however, is stubborn. It clings to the skin even when scraped, and Mara clung to hers like a woman gripping the edge of a raft in a storm. Every Friday, without fail, she stopped by the tiny gas station at the edge of town, the one with peeling paint and a clerk who always chewed toothpicks like he was solving math problems. She'd buy one ticket. Just one. Never more. She told herself it was tradition, a silly little superstition she'd picked up in her 20s, but in truth, it was all she had left that felt remotely like a wish. The act itself was sacred. Scribble the numbers, fold the slip, and tuck it deep in her coat pocket, as if hiding it from the universe might protect its luck. Henry always scoffed when he found one of the slips in the laundry. "Still buying your fairy tales?" he'd sneer, the corners of his mouth curling with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Mara never answered. Not with words, anyway. She just stopped leaving them where he could find them. She learned to tuck her hope out of reach, like a bird too tired to fly, but not quite ready to die. Then came the Tuesday that changed the tune. The day had been unremarkable, overcast and sluggish, the kind of day that melted into the wallpaper. She had stayed late at the shop, inventorying new seed packets and rearranging hanging plants that didn't need rearranging. By the time she got home, Henry had already eaten. He left her a plate on the counter, still covered with foil, a silent peace offering, or perhaps a sign of guilt. She didn't eat it. Her hands were trembling. She didn't know why at first, just a strange flutter in her chest, like an old key trying to turn a rusted lock. She sat on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, and pulled up the lottery site. Not because she expected anything, she never did, but because ritual demands its due. When the numbers loaded on the screen, they stared back at her like an old friend she didn't recognize at first. She read them once, twice, then again. The silence in the room felt heavier than before, pressing down on her shoulders like invisible hands. 12, 24, 36, 44, 50, and 6. They were hers. All of them. It took a full 5 minutes before she moved. Not to scream. Not to cry. Just to breathe. She went into the bathroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the tub, and laughed until her voice cracked. Then she cried. Not from joy, but from the terrifying truth that she now held the key to the door she thought she'd never escape. The days following Mara's quiet discovery of her fortune passed in a blur of guarded smiles and late-night pacing. Sleep became a fickle visitor, tiptoeing in only to slip away before dawn. She'd wake before the sun, not out of routine this time, but out of sheer restlessness, her thoughts louder than morning birdsong. The winning ticket sat hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway closet, sandwiched between old receipts and an envelope of unused birthday cards. It was ironic how something so small could carry the weight of 100 choices, each one heavier than the last. She spoke to no one about it, not even Rachel, her oldest friend, who had once promised they'd tell each other everything. Not this. Not yet. In the solitude of those early days, Mara moved with the precision of someone preparing to flee but unsure which direction to run. She created a new email address under a pseudonym, reached out to a lawyer in a neighboring county, and whispered her truth to him over the phone as if the walls of her own home might overhear. The lawyer, a calm-voiced man named Desmond Clay, asked few questions and gave fewer judgments. He simply laid out the options with the patience of a man used to sudden fortunes and the chaos that followed them. Mara listened, nodded, took notes, then stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror for hours that night, as if trying to find the version of herself brave enough to start over. She didn't tell Henry. Not because she feared his reaction, though part of her did, but because she knew, in the quiet pit of her gut, that if she gave him even a sliver of this miracle, he'd make it rot. Henry had a way of turning everything into a burden. He would have claimed the money was owed to him, a consolation prize for years of being stuck in a life he resented. She could already hear the accusations in his voice, the bitter edge sharpened by pride. You wouldn't have survived without me. Or worse, this changes nothing. But it changed everything. Not in the way she imagined, not with champagne or impromptu trips to Paris, but in the soft, seismic shift of knowing she no longer had to tolerate the cage she'd grown used to. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks after the lottery numbers. They were delivered to Henry's job in a sealed envelope, hand-delivered by a courier she paid in cash. She'd been deliberate, fast, strategic. There were no arguments, no second chances offered, no emotional conversations over coffee, just a signature line, a pen, and silence. He came home late that evening, later than usual, and walked through the door like a man expecting confrontation. Instead, he found her sitting on the couch, a suitcase at her feet, and the door key resting on the armrest beside her. "You're serious," he said flatly, almost amused. "After all this time?" Mara didn't blink. "Yes," she answered, the word falling from her mouth like a stone into deep water. He didn't shout, didn't plead, just stared at her as if trying to read a language he no longer understood. Then he left, the door closing behind him with the finality of a slammed book. The lake house came 2 weeks later, nestled on the far side of Elmsworth, where the trees grew thicker and the air felt newer. It sat quietly between two moss-covered hills, as if nature herself had tried to hide it. Mara had found it online late one night, in a sleepy real estate listing buried beneath outdated rentals and abandoned cabins. It wasn't extravagant. That was never her style. But it had charm, Aged brick walls, deep mahogany floors, a fireplace that breathed warmth into the room, and wide windows that drank in the sunrise like honey. She paid in full through the trust Desmond set up. No one in Elmsworth knew it belonged to her, not even the listing agent, who simply handed her the keys and walked away with a polite nod. She moved in quietly, bringing only what she needed: her books, a box of photos, a small suitcase of clothes, and her favorite kettle. She left behind the wedding china and the floral curtains she'd never liked, abandoned the creaky bed that had shared too many cold nights. The first evening in her new home, she lit a candle, poured herself a glass of red wine, and watched the lake exhale beneath the twilight. The silence was different now, no longer a threat, but a gift. She wept without warning, tears slipping down her cheeks as freely as the water rippling in the distance. Not because she was sad, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. In the days that followed, she began the slow, aching process of remembering herself, the woman who once painted her toes coral in the summer and danced barefoot in her garden, the girl who used to write poems in the margins of her textbooks. Mara didn't leap into this new life. She tiptoed, careful not to scare it away. She unpacked one box at a time, played old records on the turntable she hadn't touched in a decade, and filled the fireplace with the scent of burning cedar. Her days were quieter, but fuller. Customers at the shop noticed the shift, not in what she wore, but how she moved. Lighter, unburdened. She started wearing her hair loose again, let it curl around her shoulders the way it used to when Henry first met her. And though no one quite knew what had changed, the air around Mara began to hum with a kind of quiet certainty, like the earth after rain. Henry, meanwhile, had moved into a one-bedroom apartment above the grocery store. He didn't call, didn't write, not at first. But Mara knew better than to believe silence meant peace. She'd lived too long with the quiet before the storm. The first whisper came from the barber, a man named Clive, who rarely kept anything to himself unless it was tucked beneath his hat. He had seen Mara drive past the town square one bright morning in a cherry-red convertible, the kind of car that didn't belong to someone who paid bills in cash envelopes and reused plastic shopping bags. His client at the time, a retired schoolteacher named Elsie Banner, leaned out of the chair mid-trim to catch a glimpse of the passing vehicle. "That's Mara Whitman, isn't it?" she asked, squinting as if the truth lived just past the windshield. Clive nodded, eyes following the car like a dog watching a thrown stick. By the time the haircut was over, 3 more people had heard about it. Small towns have long memories and short thresholds for mystery, and by sundown, speculation bloomed like spring weeds. Where did she get the money? Who bought the car? Had she remarried in secret? Theories floated through Elmsworth like dust motes in sunlight, soft, endless, and impossible to ignore. In the absence of facts, imagination filled the gaps with alarming efficiency. Even her flower shop, once considered quaint and forgettable, now drew second glances and quiet murmurs. Customers lingered longer than usual, asking questions that didn't sound like questions. "Business must be good," one woman said with a smile too sharp to be innocent. Mara deflected with the grace of someone used to hiding in plain sight. But deep down, she knew the town was turning its ears in her direction, and with every passing day, the buzz grew louder. Henry's discovery didn't arrive like lightning. It came in slow, jagged pieces: a forgotten conversation, a mislaid receipt, a snippet of overheard gossip outside the post office. At first he brushed it off, chalking up Mara's changes to some fleeting windfall, maybe a family inheritance or a generous client who'd taken pity on her sad little shop. But as the stories multiplied and the whispers curled tighter around his name, the denial began to burn at the edges. He hadn't spoken to Mara since the day he left the house with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of anger, but now her image haunted him, not in memory but in motion, in that flashy car, the new clothes, the glow she wore like a second skin. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was something colder, heavier, like a stone dropped into the bottom of his stomach. One afternoon, as he sifted through a pile of old paperwork he'd brought with him from the house, just bills and envelopes he hadn't bothered to open, he found a crumpled slip, half faded but legible enough to make his breath hitch. It was a photocopy of a lottery claim receipt. The name printed at the top hit him harder than any fist. Mara Whitman. His hands trembled as he turned the paper over, as if something more might be scribbled on the back, something to prove it was a mistake. But it wasn't. The date of the claim was less than a week before the divorce was filed. That was when the silence in him broke, and the questions exploded like firecrackers in his chest. She had lied. She had planned it. She had walked out with more than her freedom. She'd taken what he believed was owed to him. The rage didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like a draft beneath a locked door, slowly, steadily, until the whole room turned cold. Henry began showing up in places he hadn't cared for in months. He wandered into the flower shop one morning under the guise of buying a bouquet for a coworker's birthday. Mara looked up from the counter, her smile faltering as their eyes met. He asked for peonies, though he knew they weren't in season, and stood there too long after she handed him a wrapped bunch of daisies instead. His eyes roamed the newly painted walls, the gleaming vases, the register that no longer stuck when opened. Business must be booming, he muttered, voice slick with something unspoken. Mara didn't answer. She watched him walk out with a sinking feeling that something had shifted beneath her feet. From that day on, he hovered in the background of her days like a lingering cough, present, persistent, and always just around the corner. She spotted his car parked down the street more than once, saw his silhouette in the window of the cafe across from her shop, felt the prickling sensation of being watched even when no one else was around. He didn't call, didn't text. But his silence was different now. It wasn't distance, it was pressure, building with each breath he held back. And though he never raised a hand or voice, Mara knew the storm had opened its eye. It wasn't long before the legal papers arrived, fat, heavy with accusations, wrapped in the stiff politeness of law firm letterhead. Henry had filed a petition to reopen their divorce, claiming financial deceit and requesting a share of what he called undisclosed marital assets. The word marital dripped with implication, as if she'd cheated not just on vows, but on fate itself. Mara read the document slowly, her fingers tightening with each sentence. He had hired a lawyer, some loudmouthed man from Ridgeville with a reputation for turning messy breakups into bloodbaths. Desmond Clay met with her the next morning, lips pressed in a tight line as he flipped through the file. He wants half, he said simply. Wants the court to believe you stole his future out from under him. But Mara didn't flinch. The fear she once had of Henry, the quiet dread she'd carried for years, was now replaced with something fiercer. She wouldn't let him claw his way back into her life through a courtroom window. She had evidence, timelines, receipts. The ticket was purchased after he left. The trust had been established legally. Her steps, though secret, had been meticulous. But even with the law on her side, the emotional toll began to stack like bricks. Each glance over her shoulder, each question from a neighbor pretending to be curious, each whisper that clung to her name like wet fabric, it all reminded her that she was no longer invisible. She was a spectacle, and Henry was turning their private unraveling into a public performance. Still, Mara held her ground. She'd lived too long under a man who believed his discontent was reason enough to keep her small. And now, even as the town watched with wide eyes and sharper tongues, she stood taller, arms wrapped around her truth like armor. He could try to rattle her. But this time, she wasn't the one trembling. It began with small trespasses, things Mara almost convinced herself she had imagined. A garden spade moved from its hook. A wind chime that no longer sang because its strings were tangled, though she was certain she'd fixed it the night before. At first she thought perhaps the wind had a cruel sense of humor. Maybe animals were to blame. But that hope dissolved quickly when she found her back gate unlatched 3 mornings in a row. She always checked the gate. Always. It was a habit born of caution, like checking the stove twice or making sure the doors were locked before bed. The third morning, when she saw the gate hanging open again, something shifted in her chest. A new kind of silence moved through the trees, thick and watching. She didn't scream, didn't call anyone, didn't even leave the porch. She just stood there, barefoot in her robe, staring at that open gate with the chill crawling up her spine like ivy. Henry hadn't spoken to her since the court filing. Not directly. His silence was not absence, it was shadow. Mara had lived with him long enough to know that when Henry grew quiet, he wasn't idle. He was planning, calculating, brewing storms behind glassy eyes. The court date was set 2 months out, but he wasn't waiting for justice. He was planting seeds of fear where comfort used to grow, and he didn't need to break anything to do it. He only had to make her doubt the edges of her own peace. She began to notice the way the sound of tires on gravel made her heart hitch, how the creak of floorboards in the dead of night no longer felt like a house settling, but like something else entirely. She changed her locks not once, but twice, installed motion lights around the perimeter of the cottage, ones that flashed like lightning if so much as a bird blinked near them. She started sleeping with a flashlight beside her pillow and an old kitchen knife tucked under the bed frame. It wasn't dramatic, it was survival. The kind of precautions a woman takes when she's been hunted before, even if the hunter wears no mask. Every creak became a question. Every shadow became a suggestion. She didn't share her fears with anyone. Not even Rachel, who'd returned to town a few weeks earlier and had dropped by unannounced with wine and gentle concern. Mara kept her smile bright and her words shallow, speaking of garden bulbs and the unpredictability of spring weather. What could she say, after all? That her ex-husband might be creeping into her yard like a ghost with unfinished business? That every time she saw a figure at the edge of her vision, her heart took off in a sprint? No. She'd learned long ago that some truths, when spoken aloud, only made you sound insane. So she watered her flowers, she arranged her displays, and she smiled for customers who now looked at her with more curiosity than kindness. But inside she was coiled tight, waiting for the moment the unspoken finally stepped forward and made itself real. It came one evening when the rain had been falling all day, soft at first, then steady, like a drumbeat that wouldn't quit. She had closed the shop early, the streets deserted except for a few committed dog walkers and delivery vans racing the clouds. The lake outside her window blurred into a silver sheet, and the trees swayed like slow dancers caught in someone else's rhythm. Mar brewed tea and curled into the corner of her couch, watching the fireplace spit occasional sparks, her thoughts drifting from legal documents to old memories like they were leaves pulled along a current. She almost didn't hear the sound, a faint creak, so light it could have been the house exhaling. But she heard it. She sat up slowly, heart a sudden drum in her chest. The tea in her hand trembled, spilling over her knuckles. She moved through the house without turning on lights, her bare feet silent on the cool wood floor. The back door was closed. The windows were latched. Everything seemed as it should be. Except it wasn't. On the hallway table, where she always placed her keys, sat something that did not belong there. A single, fresh rose. Its stem was trimmed, its petals soft and impossibly red. There was no note, no explanation, just the flower, resting as innocently as if it had grown there overnight. Her breath caught. She hadn't bought roses, not for weeks, not since she'd last seen Henry's face in her shop. And now, somehow, he'd found his way inside without shattering glass or breaking locks. He didn't need force. He needed her to know he could be there, that no matter how many fences she built, he would find a way to slip through the cracks like water finding its lowest point. The police arrived 40 minutes later, though Mara couldn't tell them anything useful. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No fingerprints. Just the rose, which now sat sealed inside a clear evidence bag like a trophy from a game no one else understood. The responding officer was kind, though his eyes held that tired doubt reserved for women who spoke in vague dangers and invisible threats. He promised to increase patrols, suggested she get a dog, maybe a camera. But there was something in his tone that told her he'd filed this kind of report before, and nothing ever came of it. Henry hadn't broken the law. He'd bent it, stretched it, pressed his weight against it until it whispered but didn't snap. The next morning, Mara sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her own reflection in the mirror. She looked older, not aged, but weathered, like someone who had survived a flood, drenched but still standing. She picked up her phone, began dialing a number she had memorized but never thought she'd use. When the voice on the other end answered, she didn't waste time. "Desmond," she said calmly, "we need to talk about protective measures before the court date." Her voice didn't shake. Not this time. She'd cried enough tears to flood every ditch in Elmsworth. Now she was done waiting for mercy. Henry had made his presence known, had delivered his message in the language of subtle threats and red petals, but Mara had learned to read between the lines, and if he thought fear would silence her, then he had mistaken her for the woman she used to be, the one who stayed quiet, who looked down, who swallowed every ache with a smile. That woman was gone. What remained was someone sharper, scarred but unbroken, and ready to confront whatever storm he brought next. The evening it happened, the sky wore its darkness like a secret, cloaking the town of Elmsworth in a thick velvet shadow that felt heavier than usual. Rain had been threatening all afternoon, but it never arrived, only hovered like a breath held too long. Mara had stayed late at the shop, distracted by paperwork she wasn't really reading, and arrangements she redid 3 times without needing to. She didn't want to go home. The cottage had begun to feel like a memory that refused to settle, safe in daylight, but strange and taut after nightfall. When she finally stepped outside, locking the door with shaking fingers, she was met by a silence that didn't belong. The streets weren't just empty, they were expectant, like something was about to emerge from the corners. Her car sat alone beneath a flickering street lamp, and as she approached, she noticed it immediately. Footprints in the dust on the driver's side window. Not from earlier. Not hers. Just enough to smudge the glass and leave a trail of damp breath behind. She froze, heart thudding against her ribs like a fist against a door. The footprints were side by side, as though someone had stood there for several minutes, face close to the glass, watching, waiting. The air thickened in her throat, but she didn't scream. She unlocked the door, slid in, and drove away, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. She didn't turn the radio on. The silence was company enough. Back at the cottage, she double-checked every lock, closed every curtain, and turned on every light. It felt foolish, this ritual of false protection, but it was all she had. She paced the hallway for a while, then stood by the fireplace, staring at nothing until her tea kettle screamed from the stove. Her thoughts moved like water circling a drain. What if this time was different? What if the rose had only been a beginning? What if next time it wasn't just her privacy being broken, but her skin, her bones, her life? She didn't call the police. They'd come once already and left with empty hands and too polite sympathy. She knew that to them this was just another ex-husband's story, a woman spooked by shadows. But Mara wasn't seeing ghosts. She was seeing the truth unraveling at the seams. Henry was growing bolder. The legal proceedings were closing in. The court date only days away now, and the mask of civility he wore was slipping with every passing hour. She thought about leaving, just for a while, driving somewhere quiet, maybe staying at Rachel's, but the idea of fleeing felt like surrender. This home, this life, this freedom, she had fought too hard to hand it over without a scar. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window until the sun cracked open the sky, watching shadows shift and branches sway. Nothing happened. But the not happening was almost worse. Waiting was its own kind of violence. The morning of the court hearing arrived without fanfare. No bird song, no light chatter of neighbors, no hum of the town waking up. It was as if even Elmsworth had held its breath. Mara dressed deliberately, choosing a navy blue blouse that matched the sharp clarity in her eyes, and black trousers that made her feel like she had armor where her softness used to be. Rachel drove her to the courthouse in a borrowed sedan, quiet the entire ride except for one moment, right before they turned off the main road. "You don't owe him anything," she said, her voice low and firm, like the strike of a match. Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The courthouse sat like a tombstone at the end of a long driveway, its pale stone facade aging beneath the weight of time and secrets. Inside, it smelled of old carpet, paper, and waiting. Henry was already seated when she entered. He wore a pressed suit that didn't quite fit, and he didn't look at her. Not once. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something that made him shift in his seat, but his face never cracked. The judge was a small, hawk-eyed woman, with a voice that left no room for pleasantries. As the hearing began, Mara sat up straight, her heart steady now. Desmond spoke with quiet authority, laying out the facts like cards on a table. Timelines, financial documents, the formation of the trust, the receipt for the ticket purchased after Henry had moved out. Every detail spoke for her, each one a brick in the wall between herself and the man who had once vowed to protect her. Henry's defense was weaker than she'd expected, a shallow blend of emotion and entitlement dressed in legalese. His lawyer tried to argue shared life, joint sacrifices, the implication that without Henry's years of support, Mara would never have had the opportunity to buy that winning ticket. But their logic sagged beneath the weight of precision. The facts stood taller. Mara had not only left him, she had untangled herself cleanly, without deceit. The money wasn't marital, it was liberation, purchased fairly, claimed legally, hidden only out of self-preservation. As her lawyer read out the final timeline, Mara looked across the room and met Henry's eyes for the first time in months. There was something wild there now, resentment twisted with disbelief, a kind of silent fury that couldn't accept defeat. He had thought she would crumble under pressure, thought her hands would shake, her voice would break, but she hadn't flinched. Not once. When the judge ruled in her favor, rejecting Henry's claim with finality, the room seemed to still. No applause, no visible reaction. Just a cold, clean sentence that cut the thread for good. Henry was led away shortly after for violating the restraining order, an outstanding warrant tied to the rose, the break-in, the watchful visits he had denied under oath. As they placed cuffs around his wrists, he turned his head slightly, not toward the bailiff, but toward her. No words, just a stare, hot and bitter. Mara didn't blink. She watched him go with the same calm that follows a storm, a silence earned, not given. Weeks passed, and the air in Elmsworth slowly exhaled. The court hearing became yesterday's noise, drifting quietly behind new gossip about potholes and local elections. Henry's name was no longer passed around with sharp excitement. It was dropped in hushed tones now, like a curse no one wanted to awaken. His sentence wasn't long, just enough time behind bars to let the dust settle and the fear dim. But for Mara, the relief didn't come with a gavel. It arrived slowly, in pieces too small to measure. It was in the first morning she left the windows open without worry, in the way she walked to the car without scanning the shadows, in the silence of her phone that once buzzed with veiled threats and missed calls. Her world was still standing, not rebuilt, but healing in quiet, unseen places. The cottage by the lake no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home. She started tending her garden again with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years, planting not for beauty, but for ritual, for rhythm, for something to do with her hands that didn't involve checking locks or watching the door. The soil welcomed her back, as if it had been waiting for her to stop surviving and start living again. And slowly, she did, one bloom at a time. She didn't tell anyone what she did with the money, not even Rachel, who had been the closest thing to family since her mother passed 5 years ago. There was no grand reveal, no splashy purchase or donation ceremony. Mara had never wanted riches. She had wanted space, time, the right to her own silence. After the hearing, she met with Desmond and made sure every cent was tucked away safely, untouchable, earning its keep without drawing attention. It wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about control. She made a few modest upgrades to the shop, not enough to turn heads, but enough to bring life back to her days. A new cooler, better shelving, brighter bulbs for the display window. She hired a teenage assistant from the high school to help after classes, a soft-spoken girl named Beth, who reminded Mara of herself at 17, curious, careful, and always watching. Sometimes they'd work side by side in comfortable quiet, the way women do when words aren't necessary. Beth never asked about the court case, though Mara knew she knew. In Elmsworth, silence often said more than speech. But in that silence, Mara found something she hadn't felt in years: respect. It wasn't just that she'd won. It was how she carried it, how she'd walked through the fire without screaming. People looked at her differently now, not as the woman who'd been left or the florist who kept to herself, but as someone who had endured and done so without begging for applause. On a crisp morning that marked the start of autumn, Mara sat on her porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a steaming mug cradled in her hands. The lake shimmered with the soft gold of early sun, and the trees whispered promises of change with every breeze. A letter had arrived the day before, no name on the envelope, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She had debated opening it, leaving it on the kitchen counter for hours, before finally slicing it open with a paring knife, more out of curiosity than fear. It wasn't long, just a few lines, apologies woven into excuses, regrets wrapped in denial. He didn't admit guilt, only grief. Claimed he was lost, that he loved her once, that he didn't understand what he'd become. Mara had read it 3 times. Not because she wanted to believe him, but because part of her needed to see the last thread unravel. She didn't reply. She folded the letter, tucked it back in the envelope, and burned it in the fireplace that night. Watching the flames eat the page was not satisfying. It was sobering. The past didn't beg for attention anymore. It had said its piece. She didn't cry. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt still. And in that stillness was the kind of peace no verdict could deliver. Life didn't become a fairy tale. There were still mornings when Mara startled at the sound of footsteps, still nights when she double-checked the lock even though she knew it hadn't moved. Trauma doesn't vanish, it echoes, but the echoes grew fainter with time, their volume dimmed by the small, consistent acts of reclaiming her life. She walked barefoot on the porch again. She drove out of town for the first time in years just to see the changing leaves. She laughed louder with Rachel, ate slower, slept longer. There were days she thought of Henry, but not with hatred. More like someone remembering a bad storm, the kind that rattles windows and floods cellars, but eventually passes. She kept the original lottery ticket in a small, worn box at the back of her dresser drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how fragile fortune could be, of how quickly joy could be hunted, of how deeply a woman could root herself when everything tried to pull her up. She never bought another ticket, not because she stopped believing in luck, but because she didn't need it anymore. She had already won the most valuable thing there was, her freedom, earned not in gold, but in grit. And from that quiet corner of Elmsworth, beneath trees older than sorrow and skies wider than memory, she built her life, not all at once, not without scars, but real, whole, and finally her own. Sometimes the people we trust the most can be the ones who hurt us the deepest. But remember this, your peace is priceless, and your silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. Never feel guilty for choosing yourself. Protect your heart, protect your mind, and when your soul says enough, listen. You don't owe anyone your freedom. Walk away if you must. Rebuild if you have to. And never forget, what's meant for you will never need to be stolen, begged for, or survived. May you never find yourself trapped in a love that silences you. May your heart always know when it's time to let go, and may your strength rise even when your world feels like it's falling apart. I pray that peace will find your doorstep and dwell in your home like a lifelong friend. May your blessings never come with sorrow, and may those who seek to harm you be kept far from your path. May your joy be louder than your past, and your healing deeper than your scars. In the quiet, may you find your strength. In the storm, may you find your way. And if this prayer touches your hearts, say with me, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.